In the frozen wasteland of Finland, where temperatures dropped to -40 degrees and snow stretched endlessly in every direction, a small figure moved like a ghost through the white silence. The year was 1939, and the Soviet Union had just declared war on tiny Finland, sending over 1 million soldiers to crush what they believed would be an easy victory. What they didn't expect was Simo Häyhä. They called him the White Death, a farmer's son who stood barely 5 feet tall and weighed less than 150 pounds. Armed with nothing but an old rifle and iron determination, this quiet man for the countryside would soon become the deadliest sniper in military history. In just 100 days of brutal winter warfare, he would single-handedly change the course of a war that the entire world expected Finland to lose within weeks. But this isn't just a story about war. This is a story about what happens when the world counts you out, when everyone believes you're too small, too weak, too ordinary to matter. This is about a man who proved that sometimes one person with unshakable resolve can stand against an army and win. The Soviets sent 200 soldiers just to hunt him down. They failed every single time. This is his story, and it will change how you think about what's possible when the odds are stacked against you. The morning frost crunched under Simo Häyhä's boots as he walked through the silent forest near his family farm in Rotjärvi, Finland. It was November 1939, and at 34 years old, Simo had lived his entire life in these woods. Every tree, every rock, every shadow was as familiar to him as his own reflection. He knew where the wind would shift, where the snow would drift deepest, and where a man could disappear completely into the landscape. Simo was not an impressive figure by most standards. Standing just 5 feet 3 inches tall, with a quiet demeanor, he looked more like a schoolteacher than a soldier. His neighbors knew him as a hard-working farmer who rarely spoke unless spoken to. He had served his mandatory military service years earlier, but nothing about him suggested he would become one of history's most feared warriors. But the neighbors didn't know about Simo's other life. Every morning before dawn, while the rest of the village slept, Simo would slip into the forest with his rifle. Not to hunt animals, though he was an excellent hunter. He hunted perfection. Hour after hour, day after day, year after year, he practiced shooting with a devotion that bordered on obsession. His rifle was an old Mosin-Nagant M28-30, a Finnish-made weapon that most modern armies would have considered outdated. Simo had owned this rifle for over a decade, and he knew every quirk, every tendency, every microscopic flaw in its mechanism. He could disassemble and reassemble it blindfolded. More importantly, he could hit a coin from 500 meters away, even in a blizzard. What made Simo truly exceptional wasn't just his shooting ability. It was his understanding of the forest itself. He had spent 30 years learning to read the wilderness like a book. He could predict weather changes hours before they happened by watching how the birds flew. He could move through snow so quietly that rabbits wouldn't notice his presence until he was close enough to touch them. These skills might have remained forever hidden in the peaceful forests of Rotjärvi, but on November 30th, 1939, everything changed. The Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, launched a massive invasion of Finland. Stalin believed this would be a quick victory, a few weeks at most to crush the small Nordic nation and expand Soviet territory. The numbers were staggering and terrifying. The Soviet Union deployed over 1 million soldiers, 6,000 tanks, and 3,800 aircraft against Finland's tiny army of 300,000 men. Most international observers gave Finland no chance whatsoever. The British military experts predicted the country would fall within 2 weeks. The French estimated it might last a month if they were lucky. But Stalin and his generals had made a critical miscalculation. They had planned for a conventional war against a conventional army. What they got instead was something entirely different, a war fought by men like Simo Häyhä who knew their homeland so intimately that they could use the land itself as a weapon. When the call came for reserves to report for duty, Simo didn't hesitate. He packed his old rifle, his white winter camouflage suit that his mother had sewn for him, and a small bag of personal belongings. As he prepared to leave his family farm, his mother pressed a thermos of hot coffee into his hands and made him promise to come home safely. Simo nodded quietly, but deep in his heart, he knew he was walking towards something that would either kill him or transform him completely. He had no way of knowing that he was about to become the most feared man in the Soviet army, or that his name would be whispered in terror around enemy campfires for generations to come. The journey to his assigned position took 2 days through snow-covered forests and frozen lakes. Simo was assigned to the 6th Company of JR-34, a unit tasked with defending the Kala River sector. This was considered one of the most dangerous assignments in the entire Finnish defense line. The Soviets were expected to throw wave after wave of attacks at this position, and casualties were expected to be enormous. When Simo arrived at his designated area, he found a landscape that looked like the end of the world. The temperature had dropped to minus 35 degrees Celsius, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. The snow was waist-deep in most places and deeper in the drifts. Trees stood like frozen sentinels, their branches heavy with ice that tinkled like wind chimes in the brutal Arctic wind. Most soldiers would have looked at this environment and seen only misery and hardship. Simo saw opportunity. This wasn't just terrain to him. It was his home field advantage. Every snowbank could become a hiding place. Every frozen tree could provide cover. Every ridge and valley was a potential shooting position that he had been unconsciously mapping in his mind for 30 years. His commanding officers quickly realized they had someone special on their hands. While other soldiers struggled with the basics of winter survival, Simo moved through the frozen wilderness as if he had been born to it. He could dig a sniper's nest in snow so perfectly concealed that enemy soldiers could walk within feet of his position without detecting him. But it wasn't until the first Soviet attack came that anyone truly understood what they were dealing with. On the morning of December 1st, 1939, the sound of engines and shouting voices echoed across the frozen landscape. Through the trees came the first wave of Soviet infantry, dozens of soldiers in brown winter coats, moving in formation through the snow. Simo lay motionless in his carefully prepared position, his rifle steady, his breathing controlled. He watched through his iron sights as the enemy soldiers approached, counting their numbers, noting their weapons, calculating distances with the precision of a mathematician. When a lead soldier came within range, Simo made his first shot of the Winter War. The bullet traveled nearly 400 meters through the frigid air before finding its target with devastating accuracy. The enemy soldier dropped instantly, and chaos erupted in the Soviet ranks. They dove for cover behind trees and snowbanks, their voices shouting commands in Russian that echoed across the winter silence. But Simo was already gone. By the time the enemy soldiers began searching for the shooter, he had melted back into the forest like smoke. This would become his signature: one shot, one kill, then disappear completely before anyone could locate his position. What happened next would establish the pattern that would define the next 100 days of Simo's life. The Soviet forces, frustrated by their invisible enemy, began sending larger and larger patrols to hunt for the mysterious sniper. They brought in dogs, they brought in tracker teams, they even brought in their own snipers specifically trained to hunt other snipers. Every attempt failed. Simo didn't just know these forests. He had become part of them. He could lie motionless in the snow for hours without moving a muscle, even when enemy soldiers passed close enough to touch him. He could shoot and relocate so quickly that muzzle flash and sound seemed to come from completely different directions. Within the first week, word of the White Death had spread throughout the Soviet ranks. Soldiers began to fear entering certain areas of the forest. Some units refused to advance without overwhelming backup support. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical casualties. Soviet commanders, growing increasingly frustrated, began to realize they weren't fighting an ordinary enemy soldier. They were facing someone who combined the skills of their best snipers with an intimate knowledge of the terrain that no outsider could possibly match. This wasn't just warfare. It was art, practiced by a master who had spent a lifetime perfecting his craft. As December wore on and Simo's kill count continued to climb, the Soviet High Command made a decision that would define the rest of the Winter War. They would dedicate significant resources to hunting down this one man. Elite sniper teams were reassigned from other fronts. Specialized equipment was shipped in from Moscow. Some of the Soviet Union's most experienced killers were given one mission: find Simo Haiha and eliminate him. They had no idea they were about to enter a game where Simo held every advantage, and where the rules of conventional warfare simply didn't apply. The real war was just beginning. By mid-December 1939, Simo Haiha had become more than just a sniper. He had become a ghost story that haunted the Soviet army. Radio communications intercepted by Finnish intelligence revealed the growing panic in enemy ranks. Soviet soldiers had begun referring to him as Belaya Smrt, the White Death, and his reputation had spread far beyond the Kala River sector where he operated. The psychological warfare was devastating. Soviet units would approach seemingly empty forest areas, only to have their lead scouts suddenly drop dead with no warning. The remaining soldiers would scramble for cover, spraying bullets randomly into the trees, hitting nothing but snow and bark. Then silence would return, and they would realize their invisible enemy had vanished once again. Major Dmitry Volkov was the first specialist the Soviet command sent to deal with Simo. Volkov was considered one of their finest snipers, a man who had earned his reputation in conflict across Eastern Europe. He arrived at the Kala front with confidence and a rifle equipped with the latest telescopic sight technology. One farmer with an old gun, Volkov told his men as they prepared for their first hunt. "How difficult can this be?" Volkov's strategy was methodical and professional. He studied maps of Simo's previous kills, trying to identify patterns in his movement and positioning. He set up elaborate observation posts with clear sight lines across the most likely sniper positions. He brought thermal equipment to detect body heat signatures in the snow. For 3 days, Volkov and his team searched the frozen wilderness. They found old shooting positions, evidence of Simo's presence, but never the man himself. On the 4th morning, Volkov was studying the terrain through his scope when he noticed something strange: a small mound of snow that seemed slightly out of place among the natural drifts. As Volkov focused his telescopic sight on the suspicious snow pile, Simo was already watching him through iron sights from a completely different direction. Simo had spotted the Soviet sniper team the moment they entered his territory. He had spent 2 days studying their patterns, learning their habits, waiting for the perfect moment. The shot came from 450 meters away, fired from a position Volkov never suspected. The bullet found its mark with surgical precision, and Major Dmitry Volkov became another addition to Simo's growing reputation. The remaining members of his team fled in panic, abandoning their equipment and their mission. News of Volkov's death reached Soviet headquarters within hours, and the response was swift and massive. They assigned an entire company of elite troops, over 200 men, specifically to hunt down one Finnish farmer. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were Spetsnaz operatives, the Soviet Union's most highly trained special forces personnel. Captain Sergei Kozlov led this new hunting party. Unlike Volkov, Kozlov was a student of unconventional warfare. He understood that they weren't hunting an ordinary sniper. They were facing someone who had turned the forest itself into a weapon. Kozlov's approach was completely different. Instead of trying to outsnipe Simo, he focused on cutting off his escape routes and forcing him into predetermined killing zones. He deployed his 200 men in a complex web throughout the forest, with overlapping fields of fire and multiple fallback positions. "We don't need to see him to kill him," Kozlov explained to his men. "We just need to force him to move, and then we kill everything that moves." For the first time since the war began, Simo found himself truly challenged. The Soviet net was tightening around his operational area, and their new tactics were sophisticated enough to pose a real threat. Instead of random patrols that he could easily avoid, he now faced coordinated teams that moved with purpose and intelligence. Simo adapted the only way he knew how, by becoming even more invisible than before. He began moving exclusively at night, using routes so treacherous that even experienced winter soldiers wouldn't attempt them. He crawled through frozen streams that would give most men hypothermia in minutes. He squeezed through spaces between fallen trees that seemed too narrow for a human body. The cat-and-mouse game that developed over the next 3 weeks was unlike anything in military history. During the day, 200 Soviet Special Forces soldiers would methodically search every square meter of forest where Simo might be hiding. They used dogs, metal detectors, even primitive heat-sensing equipment. But Simo had advantages that technology couldn't overcome. He knew every cave, every hollow log, every natural shelter in hundreds of square kilometers of wilderness. More importantly, he had learned to think like the forest itself. When the hunting parties moved in formation, he could predict their routes hours in advance by reading subtle signs in the snow and trees that revealed wind patterns and natural pathways. The breakthrough came when Simo realized he needed to change his strategy completely. Instead of running from the hunting parties, he would hunt the hunters. Using his intimate knowledge of the terrain, he began setting elaborate traps that turned the Soviets' own tactics against them. He would leave false trails in the snow that led Soviet teams into natural dead ends, box canyons, and frozen marshes where they became sitting targets. He learned to use the forest acoustics to make gunshots seem to come from completely different directions, sending entire squads chasing phantom snipers while he struck from unexpected angles. The most legendary incident of this period became known as the Christmas Massacre. On December 24th, 1939, Captain Kozlov's forces had finally cornered Simo in what appeared to be an inescapable position. They had him surrounded on 3 sides, with the frozen Kala River blocking his escape route to the 4th side. Kozlov was confident this would be the end of the White Death. His men moved in slowly, maintaining radio contact, ready to concentrate overwhelming firepower on any position where Simo might appear. What they didn't realize was that Simo had spent the previous night preparing for exactly this scenario. As the Soviet forces closed their trap, Simo began his counterattack. Moving with inhuman speed and precision, he struck from positions that seemed physically impossible. He would fire from one location, then appear seconds later hundreds of meters away to fire again. The Soviet soldiers began shooting at shadows, their coordination breaking down as panic set in. Over the course of 6 hours, Simo systematically eliminated the hunting party that had been sent to kill him. He used the frozen river as a highway, moving beneath the ice layer through air pockets that only someone with his intimate knowledge of the waterway would know existed. He struck like lightning and vanished like smoke, leaving behind a trail of eliminated enemies and shattered Soviet confidence. By nightfall on Christmas Eve, Captain Kozlov was dead, and fewer than 30 of his 200-man hunting party remain alive. The survivors were treated in complete disorder, many of them suffering for what would later be recognized as combat trauma. They had been beaten not just tactically, but psychologically destroyed by an enemy who seemed to possess supernatural abilities. The news of the Christmas Massacre reached the highest levels of the Soviet military command. Stalin himself was reportedly briefed on the situation, and the response was unprecedented. They began referring to the Finnish sniper not as a military target, but as a strategic threat that required the full attention of the Soviet war machine. But even as the Soviets planned their next move, Simo was already preparing for the deadliest phase of his war. He had proven that he could not only survive against overwhelming odds, but that he could turn those odds into weapons against his enemies. The boy from the farm had become something entirely new, a force of nature that the Soviet Union's million-man army could not contain. Winter was deepening, temperatures were dropping even further, and Simo Hi-Ho was just getting started. The real test was about to begin. January 1940 brought the harshest weather Finland had seen in decades. Temperatures plummeted to minus 43 degrees Celsius, cold enough to freeze human breath before it left the lungs. The snow had accumulated to depths that swallowed entire buildings, creating a white wasteland that seemed more like an alien planet than Earth. For most armies, such conditions would have forced a complete halt to military operations. But for Simo Häyhä, the brutal cold had become his greatest ally. The extreme weather drove most Soviet patrols back to their heated bunkers and camps, leaving the wilderness to him alone. He moved through this frozen hell like he was taking a casual walk through a summer meadow. By this point, Simo's confirmed kill count had reached numbers that seemed impossible for a single person. Soviet intelligence reports, later captured by Finnish forces, showed that their own military had documented over 200 casualties attributed directly to the White Death. But Simo himself never kept count. He was fighting for his homeland's survival, not collecting trophies. The Soviet response to their repeated failures had become increasingly desperate and extreme. They brought in artillery units specifically to bombard areas where Simo had been spotted, turning entire sections of forest into moonscapes of splintered trees and crater-filled snow. They deployed chemical weapons, hoping to flush him out of suspected hiding places. They even attempted to use aircraft to hunt him from above, despite the danger of flying in the brutal winter conditions. Nothing worked. Simo had evolved beyond being merely an expert marksman. He had become something that transcended normal human limitations. He could remain motionless in snow for 18 hours straight, his body temperature somehow staying warm enough to survive while remaining undetectable to thermal sensors. He could shoot accurately while his hands were so cold that most men couldn't even hold a rifle steady. The most remarkable incident of this period occurred on January 17, 1940, exactly 1 year before the current date in our story. Soviet forces had decided to try a new approach. Instead of hunting Simo directly, they would destroy everything he might use for shelter or concealment. A massive bombing campaign began at dawn, with wave after wave of Soviet aircraft dropping incendiary bombs across Simo's known operational area. The attack lasted for 6 hours and created an inferno that could be seen from 50 kilometers away. Every tree for miles was reduced to ash and splinters. Every natural shelter was obliterated. The landscape looked like the surface of hell. Soviet commanders were confident that no human being could have survived such devastation. They sent reconnaissance teams into the bombed area to confirm that the White Death had finally been eliminated. What they found instead would become the stuff of military legend. Not only had Simo survived the bombing, but he had used the chaos as cover to relocate to a completely unexpected position. As the Soviet reconnaissance teams picked their way through the still-smoking wasteland, Simo opened fire from a direction they never anticipated. He had somehow made his way to higher ground during the bombardment and was now shooting down at them from positions that should have been impossible to reach. The psychological impact of this incident broke something fundamental in Soviet morale. Their soldiers began to believe they were fighting something supernatural, something that couldn't be killed by conventional means. Desertion rates skyrocketed. Entire units began refusing orders to enter areas where the White Death might be operating. But Simo's greatest test was yet to come. Moscow had finally decided to end the embarrassment of being unable to eliminate one Finnish farmer. They assembled what they called Operation Wolfpack, a massive coordinated assault involving over 1,000 elite troops, supported by tanks, artillery, and air power. The plan was simple in its scope and terrifying in its execution. They would surround a 50-square-kilometer area with such overwhelming force that escape would be impossible. Then they would systematically destroy every hiding place, every potential shelter, every square meter of ground until the White Death was finally cornered and eliminated. General Alexei Novikov personally supervised the operation. He was a veteran of conflicts across the Soviet Empire, a man who had built his career on solving impossible military problems. As he studied maps of the target area, he made a promise to his superiors in Moscow. Within 1 week, the White Death will be just another dead partisan. Operation Wolfpack began on February 10th, 1940, with the largest concentration of military force ever directed at a single individual in human history. The Soviet ring of steel closed slowly and methodically, with units maintaining constant radio contact and overlapping fields of fire. For 3 days, the operation proceeded exactly as planned. The Soviet forces compressed their perimeter hour by hour, searching every hiding place, investigating every possible escape route. Their confidence grew as they found evidence of Simo's recent presence, but no sign of the man himself. On the 4th day, something extraordinary happened. Instead of trying to escape the tightening net, Simo decided to fight his way out through the strongest part of the Soviet line. It was a decision that defied every principle of military tactics and common sense, which is exactly why it worked. At 0300 hours on February 14th, 1940, Simo began what would become known as the Valentine's Day Miracle. Moving with impossible speed and precision in the pre-dawn darkness, he struck at the heart of the Soviet formation like a force of nature. He had spent the previous days studying the enemy positions, learning their routines, identifying the exact moment when their guard would be lowest. When he struck, it was with the accumulated fury of 3 months of constant warfare. The attack lasted 4 hours and covered nearly 20 kilometers of snow-covered terrain. Simo moved through the Soviet lines like a ghost, striking from unexpected angles, eliminating sentries and communication personnel with surgical precision. He disrupted command structures, destroyed equipment, and created such chaos that Soviet units began firing on each other in the confusion. By sunrise, Operation Wolfpack had collapsed into complete disorder. General Novikov was among the casualties, and the 1,000-man force had been reduced to scattered groups of demoralized soldiers trying to find their way back to Soviet lines. But Simo's war was about to come to an abrupt end in a way that no one expected. On March 6th, 1940, as he was engaged in what would be his final sniper mission, a Soviet soldier got extraordinarily lucky. An explosive bullet from an enemy rifle struck Simo in the face, shattering his jaw and cheekbone and leaving him unconscious in the snow. By all rights, he should have died there in the frozen wilderness where he had become a legend. But somehow, Finnish patrol members found him and managed to get him to a field hospital. For 11 days, he lay in a coma while surgeons worked to save his life. Simo awakened on March 17th, 1940, the same day that Finland and the Soviet Union signed the peace treaty that ended the Winter War. He had missed the war's conclusion by hours, but his contribution to Finland's survival had been immeasurable. The official records showed that in just 100 days of combat, Simo Häyhä had achieved over 500 confirmed kills using only iron sights on his old rifle. But the numbers, impressive as they were, told only part of the story. He had single-handedly created a legend that would haunt Soviet military planning for decades. More importantly, he had proven something fundamental about human potential. When everything seems impossible, when the odds are stacked overwhelmingly against you, when the entire world expects you to fail, there is still something inside the human spirit that can rise to meet any challenge. Simo returned to his family farm after the war, where he lived quietly for the rest of his life. He never spoke publicly about his experiences, never wrote memoirs, never sought fame or recognition for what he had accomplished. He returned to being what he had always been at heart, a farmer who loved his homeland enough to defend it against impossible odds. When asked years later about his incredible achievements, Simo would only say, "I did what I had to do." But those simple words carried the weight of a truth that every person who has ever faced impossible circumstances can understand. Sometimes, when everything is on the line, ordinary people discover they are capable of extraordinary things. Sometimes, one person really can make a difference that changes the course of history. Sometimes, being underestimated becomes the greatest advantage of all. The boy from the farm who became the White Death proved that when you combine unshakable determination with perfect preparation and absolute commitment, there are no limits to what can be achieved. He showed the world that David really can defeat Goliath, as long as David refuses to believe that defeat is inevitable. Simo Häyhä died peacefully in 2002 at the age of 96, having lived to see his small nation become one of the most prosperous and respected countries in the world. He never knew that his story would inspire countless people around the globe who face their own impossible odds. But perhaps that's fitting. The greatest heroes rarely realize they are heroes. They just do what needs to be done, one shot at a time, one day at a time, until the impossible becomes inevitable.